All right. Hey, welcome to anybody that's stopping by. This is a new podcast that we're going to be starting. We're calling it History Through Our Screens, and we're going to be taking a look at how popular media is depicting history and kind of our views on that. My name is Jasper Gorren. I've got a history degree from undergrad, and I've always enjoyed history growing up, studying it. Definitely the odd kid that stuck to History Channel instead of ESPN, and luckily, I've fallen into a group of guys that also enjoy history as well. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dan, also SLDRT. I've always just kind of been interested in history my whole life. Did a lot of reading. I also was kind of the guy always watching the History Channel. My main reason for getting into even gaming was mostly history related games. So it's just always been a passion for me.
And my name is Trevor. I was always the guy who was, whenever I went to the store, I wanted to buy an army set or something with vehicles. And I was always drawing tanks in school, and I've just always been interested in history.
Very nice. So I think just to give you all an idea of the format going forward, I think we're going to try to stick to at least an hour long and give kind of a broad topic that everyone's going to give their perspective on going forward. And it's going to be everyone's opinion. I'm not going to say that we're right or wrong, but just giving some perspective on how today's media looks at history. All right, guys, this is the first episode of History Through Our Screens that we are going to record as a group. The theme for today was really just the overarching theme of the entire podcast in a nutshell, which is each of us has kind of gone through and thought about a piece of media that we both feel positively reflects on history and encourages people to study more into it, and a piece that we each might feel is more negative and may not depict histories accurately or doesn't necessarily encourage people to go out and learn something on their own. So again, I'm joined by Dan, also goes by Soldart, and Trevor. And everyone's looked at some pieces of media that they either like or dislike for those reasons, and we're going to go through each of those today. All right, Dan, you want to go through your topics first?
Yeah, sure. So, as a positive, uh, I think Master and Commander is a good movie to bring up. Uh, in terms of movies, I think it really represents an accurate depiction of naval life in the time period. I mean, we see this, ship crew go through the battle in the beginning. It basically tears apart their ship, and we watch the surgeries and the aftermath. We see people get sea time surgery, which always isn't a clean thing. We see them have to land, make new masts. I mean, I think it's a really accurate depiction. Uh,
Right, and so for anyone that's watching that isn't as familiar, can you just give a real quick synopsis?
so basically, we follow the crew of a ship, a British ship, in the South American Galapagos region, as they, in the beginning of the movie, are encountered by a French frigate that kind of tears them up in the smoke, and they have to make repairs. We see them go to the Galapagos. Then it climaxes in a final battle.
Right, and I think it was Napoleonic era, if I remember the movie right.
It was.
Yeah, it's going to be
I'm not
some.
sure off the top of my head the exact dates the movie was based in.
Yeah, I think actually it's also a book series as well.
Is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think that character has his own book series
Mm.
as well.
And the full title of the movie is Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World.
Yes.
Uh, and the date is 1805. It is aboard the HMS Surprise.
Very nice. And you felt kind of afterwards when you were watching it, not only from I guess, a historical accuracy perspective, but from it just kind of maybe it encouraged you to go and learn something additional about it as well.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think it encourages that kind of after research, like, hey, I wonder if that's actually, how that happened, or I wonder if there's any realistic history for this.
Anything you found in particular on that?
Um, Not in particular. I mean, we get some names of the ships, like the HMS Surprise, which was an actual ship. Uh, and there's references to battles in the movie that don't exactly represent historical battles that took place, but I mean, during the Napoleonic era, we had skirmishes between ships happening all over the place.
Definitely. Well, naval combat not being confined just to mainland Europe at that point.
Absolutely. I think what a lot of people don't understand is they really think of the Caribbean as the naval field, which I think kind of leads into my negative. Uh, as unfortunately, the Pirates of the Caribbean, I
Hmm.
think, is a negative reflection of piracy and naval combat at the time. Uh, Master and Commander really focuses on more of the South American region, which I think is really underrated when people think about naval combat in the Napoleonic time.
Well, it's also amazing just to realize the range of those ships, even at that time period, that going around the world had been done, and that they were able to carry out logistics that far.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see it in the movie. I mean, the ship is almost self-sufficient to a point.
I know one thing that I remember that struck me about that movie was watching the. I know this is a kind of a British naval tradition, but just how young some of the ensigns were, the young officers that they had
Yeah,
on the ship that were,
I
I guess,
I think
officers in training.
yeah, I also think that's a big positive and kind of goes along with not only British, but I think that was almost kind of a general practice throughout. I mean, back then we had children as young as, 12, 11 sometimes on these ships.
And that's a very, very interesting way to learn your trade, growing up with it.
Yeah, I mean, you either learn your trade or you don't need a trade, to put it lightly.
True. I mean, and they even depict one of the younger officers receives a battlefield amputation, I believe.
Yes, yeah. He receives kind of a messy amputation. We see in the surgery during the battle, the doctor's trying to keep people alive and they're having to pour sand onto the floor so that he has a stable base to stand because of not only the blood involved in something like that, but also, water coming into the ship and just the movement of the sea in general.
Sure. I mean, nothing is clean, I guess you would say, as a modern naval engagement.
Yeah,
It's not the. I guess it's not as much of a sterile environment, if that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, in the movie, does someone gets infected, don't they? Is it that same battlefield amputation?
I don't remember if he gets infected. I think the surgeon gets pretty sick, and he actually has to do some procedures on himself, if I remember right.
Oh, yes, he does. He does.
But yeah, I remember there's a
Yeah.
scene where he's holding up a mirror trying to
Yeah.
perform some surgery on himself.
I do remember that. And then we see him later in the movie. He's on crutches.
If I remember right, he got shot by one of the British Marines on his own ship by accident.
I think you're correct. Yes. You know what? I just realized you bringing that up. I don't think we really saw punishment. I know punishment was mentioned for that British soldier, but it would have been interesting to see uh, the punishment carried out. I think.
Yeah, and I'm sure that any historical account you find will not shy away from it at the time, but naval punishments particularly, because people today would consider them pretty harsh, and lashing you to the mast and whipping you.
Hmm. Or tying you to the front of the ship. Uh,
Right.
you know, or I guess the most extreme way that I guess was commonly used was pirates for
Keel
execution was
haul.
yeah, keel hauling.
Can you explain keel hauling practice?
I believe you would tie a person up and you would throw them over the side of the ship that would allow them to be dragged under and up to the other side. That way they would scrape the barnacles, and most of the time you were not expecting them to survive. But if they did, that was punishment enough.
Okay, so possible death sentence, and if you make it, good for you.
It was really brutal.
Well, I think to that point is Dan's negative with the Pirates of the Caribbean. It definitely the the pirates are depicted in kind of a positive manner.
Extremely.
Yeah. I
And
think
I
what
mean,
that,
go
not to
ahead.
interrupt you, but I think what that movie kind of doesn't depict is also kind of the brutality of pirate life, you know? We see a little bit of that, I feel like, with the kind of infighting with Captain Jack and Barbosa. You see they're both kind of vying for that captain position throughout the series.
They are, and I mean, I guess that does depict some of the way that the pirate structure would have been, I guess, since it's less formal from authority. I guess that makes sense that there'd be some friction on ships like that. But I think it does stop short of some of the brutality that would have been realistic, especially in the combat.
Absolutely.
Whereas I think Master and Commander doesn't, you know, it's not glorification of the gore in that movie, but it doesn't shy away from the reality that if you're on a wooden warship taking cannon fire, that injuries are going to be common, and the injuries that were sustained were pretty brutal.
Yeah.
I think Pirates of the Caribbean is, if we're referring to the first one, is kind of able to sidestep that by having an enemy that was invulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah, they do kind of, I guess, get away with kind of stepping around that fact.
Right. And I mean, at the end of the day, it is a Disney movie, so they're going to have some limitations to
Yeah, fair enough.
how
But I think
graphic it
that
is.
leads kind of into the differences too of like movies that are made for entertainment and movies that are made for more of a kind of niche historical entertainment crowd.
Right. Did you get the sense that at least the director on Master and Commander he was trying to kind of educate as well?
You know, I do. I think we wouldn't have gotten a lot of these scenes. I guess you could say they were for also kind of an emotional connection. But I mean, showing us little bits and pieces like, the surgeon calling for sand to be poured on the floor, or, men working the pumps underneath when they sustain damage. I think all of this, securing, cutlery in the captain's cabin before the combat. I think the little details like this kind of helps solidify that in a positive manner.
Right. And I guess there's a balance between being able to put that thing in there and just dragging it out too much and making it a documentary.
Right. I would agree.
Which I'm glad that they were able to maintain that balance in Master and Commander, where it wasn't a classroom lesson. I remember it still being entertaining.
Yeah, it was definitely an entertaining movie. I don't know if it went for kind of the theatric entertainment, like Pirates of the Caribbean has, but it was still entertaining in its own right.
Right, and I mean, it's something even though I've sat down and watched it multiple times, it wasn't just a one and done. I didn't think. I think it held up well enough. And it is nice to have, I guess at least we're going to be somewhat biased in our perspective, but it is nice to have some focus on exploring the time period as well as the entertainment.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up for what I was wanting to talk about.
Yeah. Trevor, anything else you want to add on this?
Not that I could think of.
All right. Anything else you want to put on your positive negative comparison, or you want to move to the next set?
Well, we can move on, and then if I get something later, and we'll just throw it on there.
Sure thing. All right, I guess I'll kind of discuss the two things that I looked at for examining our theme for this week was for my positive, and I do have a fond kind of bias towards the Total War series that Sega has put out, which is a kind of a cross between a turn-based and a real-time strategy series of historical video games that Total War has put out throughout the years that cover a lot of different historical times, anywhere from Shogunate in Rome or in Shogunate in Japan, Rome, medieval Europe. See, they had a few that were more modern, such as Napoleon. Then for my
Napoleon.
negative, I did look at the film U-571, which is a American submarine movie about capturing the Enigma machine from the Germans. So I know Dan, you wanted to maybe push back on the positives of Total War. So I guess we can kind of start with that.
Yeah, I think overall the series is probably a positive.
Right.
Um, and again, I think it plays into that kind of balance of entertainment and realism. But I mean, take for instance the kind of the direction they're going with the newer games with things like hero units, which I to a degree support. I mean, because obviously, champions were a big deal at the time for some of these time periods. Uh, but I think they're a little over dramatized for the game, I would say.
I would agree, and I hope it's not a trend they continue, but at least, I don't know, at least the ones I grew up with, the classics like, I guess, Rome 1 and Medieval 2, especially. I don't know, the positive I see in it is that I was able to go through it, and while even though I was enjoying the entertainment of the game, it did make me want to go out and research things further. And I think the game even kind of aids you in that by every now and then it'll throw you a pop-up. It'll give you, for example, you're in Rome and the year turns and it gives you the events for that year that would have happened in real time, which I thought was a nice touch that not a lot of people go out of their way to show, especially in the video game market.
In
Yeah, I could
between,
definitely agree.
like loading screens, you always get quotes, like historical quotes that are real things, or some events like that. And I think those really make you want to look into it too.
They do, and it's nice they give you the author and sometimes even the context to go, and you can find these quotes
Yeah,
and kind of see what they were referring to. And not only that, and I think in a very interactive way, not that the combat is ultra realistic, but it does give you some perspective on, this is how humans during this time period had conflict. And it kind of gives you perspective on how different our understanding of it is now compared to then.
yeah. Armies had to be a lot bigger back then to actually do something because the weapons just weren't as advanced.
No, no, you couldn't. No, you couldn't engage your enemy from miles and miles away. It was, armies, the fastest they moved was the speed of a horse, and a lot of the engagements were in hand-to-hand fighting, and it's just a much different form of combat than at least we're used to in our modern day. And I think
Yeah.
going through those games and having that experience and dealing with that as part of your, warfare being part of the politics of that game, you kind of, it gives you some perspective on how they thought about things, which I think is the positive there. And it made me want to go out and research a lot more about it. And I'm
Yeah.
sure y'all both had experiences with that series as well.
Oh, definitely.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I grew up on Rome.
Mhm.
I mean, the Total War series is what pushed me away from consoles and into the computer scene. Strictly originally was for that series of games.
Yeah, Empire Total War was for me. And
Mm.
I mean, I guess I should know more about the Revolutionary War than I did at the time, but it really helped me look into it more.
And I'd argue, I agree. The newer push in some of the games is not, I guess, is focused on historical accuracies. Maybe it used to be, but I do like that it encourages you to want to learn more. Which I think if you're gonna have a piece of media that focuses on history, that's an important thing to throw out there. Because the more you learn about history, the more you know that it's hard to take things at face value.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So I think that kind of covers the Total War, unless y'all want to add anything else to that.
No, I think we covered it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of historical Total War games, I think that covers it.
Right, and I mean they have made some in that series that gone way beyond the historical genre, but that's kind of a whole separate deal.
Oh, Warhammer.
Yeah, well, it exists. I don't, I still enjoy them for what they are, but I'm not going to those seeking any kind of
Oh, Three
historical
Kingdoms.
enjoyment. Yeah, Three Kingdoms, I guess, is the debatable one just because of how it sits. It's right at that crux of, those events that happen in history, but the way they're depicted by the company in that time period is more fictional.
Mm. And you'll have to forgive me because my Asian history isn't that great.
Mhm.
But if I remember correctly, we don't really have a lot of accurate information on that kind of Three Kingdom Chinese period, do we?
Well, I think a lot of the sources come from a series of works that are, and I hate comparing history to history, but it's kind of similar to how we view Homer in regards to the Iliad.
Mm.
You know, it's written in a style that's very, it romanticizes the heroes. Um, Maybe it doesn't spend as much time detailing the events as it does trying to create a narrative that goes through the time period.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of the information comes from that. I think you can see a lot of the inspiration for the design of that game through that because a lot of the heroes are highlighted as almost separate characters.
Yeah.
I haven't spent a lot of time with that title in particular, but at least that's what I've seen their design kind of pointed towards that direction.
Yeah. I personally haven't spent a lot of time with that particular title either.
And maybe eventually I get onto it. It's hard for me to get away from some of the older titles I still enjoy from them.
Hmm. I think the last title I probably actively played, to be honest, was Rome 2.
Right. And I mean I think at the end of the day, even though I know it had a rough release coming out, I think it accomplished what it wanted to.
Yeah.
And I still enjoy it, and I still like poking around with, the community that creates modifications that are more, they dive deeper into kind of the nitty gritty of the history.
Mm. For sure, especially I'm blanking on the name now, but I'm sure you know the kind of ultra realism mod for Rome 2.
Yeah, that's the thing. There are a few different choices for that. I
Um
think it's DEI.
yeah.
Yeah, if I remember right.
Yeah, I believe so.
But before we get too far down the Total War rabbit hole, to go back to the negative, I know I didn't compare two similar things in the same genre, but just to throw a movie in there to recapture different piece of media. I did look at U571 as a negative example, not because it wasn't entertaining or it didn't depict, um, people during the Second World War as they kind of would have been, but just because that movie in particular. So the the plot of the movie is it covers the Allies' attempt to capture the Enigma machine, which is a coding device that the Germans use to communicate messages throughout their military in a way that the Allies couldn't transcribe it. So a lot of these Enigma machines ended up on German U-boats so that they could communicate. And the Americans in this movie hatched a plan to go out there and seize the Enigma machine using a false some they kind of made one of their submarines look like a U-boat, and they went out there to sneak onto the German U-boat and capture it. And while the movie is entertaining, it kind of does cut out the historical reality that the Enigma machine was captured by the British even before the Americans entered the war, and it happened to be by a British ship called the HMS Bulldog, which was, I believe, was a destroyer that damaged the U-boat so bad it had to surface, and then they were able to seize the Enigma machine. And from there, the British put a lot of effort cracking the code, which they would later on use to protect some of their convoys from U-boat attacks. But it didn't sit right with me that they kind of cut out the British contribution to that. So I don't know if either of y'all have seen that one recently.
No, I haven't.
I haven't seen it super recently, but I have watched the movie a fair amount of times in my younger days, so I feel like I'm still pretty fresh on the movie. And I would agree, it does kind of cut the British almost entirely out of the movie. In fact, do we even see a British character in the movie?
No, and I mean it does at the very end of the movie. If you sit for the beginning of the credits, it does mention the actual event with the bulldog. But I mean the Enigma was captured by British effort even before the Americans entered the war, and I feel like it. You could have told just as much of an interesting story with the actual events. And I think the Allies did actually get their hands on an Enigma, or I mean, not the Allies, the Americans did, but it wasn't until I think later in the war, maybe 1944. But until then, I mean, the British spent a good amount of effort on German code cracking, and were very successful at it.
Yeah, I can see where that would be a negative for the movie for sure. And I think overall, the movie is maybe leaning more towards a negative. But I think there's a few key things that I like about the movie
Sure.
that kind of capture the period. And I think a lot of that has to do with actually the interaction between the Americans capturing the U boat and the crew of the U boat. We see kind of that, not necessarily racial tension, but kind of, opposite sides enemy tension that kind of escalates in the movie. There's a big confrontation where they end up getting into a scuffle and people are killed. But
Right. If I remember, I think they're holding them prisoner, and one of the prisoners gets loose and damages the U-boat further, and kills one of the American characters that's guarding him.
I believe so. I believe they locked them in I think it's the bunk room of the U-boat. I think he actually wiggles one of the pipings for the bed frame loose, unless I'm mistaken, or it's a wrench, something along that line.
I know later that the prisoner in question, they recapture him again, and then he's later killed by a wrench because he figures out how to tap on the side of the U-boat to send an SOS signal to a German destroyer.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking of with the
Mhm.
wrench. Yeah, I think that's kind of a positive for the movie. I mean, because definitely there would have been a lot of tension, between the sides.
Right, because I mean, I think the character in question that carried out the killing of the American after he was captured was the captain, so he'd have definitely maybe I don't know, not the highest stakes, but he definitely was probably most attached to that submarine as its captain and didn't want to see it in enemy hands.
Definitely, definitely.
And I just, not that the movie on its own is negative, I feel like it does cut out some of the other allies' contribution, and that's kind of maybe a larger theme, and maybe something we'll cover later about how the Americans, especially with World War II, it feels very much like we look at the war through our lens entirely and see our efforts as maybe the ones that mattered the most
Mm,
and seem to cut out some of our allies. And I
I
think,
think people definitely see it that way.
yeah. And I mean, the way that our education, the way that we're taught about World War II, I can see why. I mean, D-Day always being the highlight event for the Allies, even though it happened later in the war. There are a lot of other
right.
key events and, a real focus on us learning about Pearl Harbor. Not that those things shouldn't be learned about, but we do look at that war very heavily through our own lens, even though it involved a lot of other people.
And even just to kind of briefly touch on D-Day, if I remember
Mhm.
correctly, the Americans didn't even have the highest amount of beachheads, correct? Wasn't that the British?
If you count the Canadians as British, then yes,
Okay.
because we had two, the British had two, and the Canadians had one, but they were really under the Commonwealth flag at that point. So,
Right. Which I
and they
mean,
also dropped airborne divisions as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which, not to get sidetracked, but briefly runs off into kind of another poor movie, Overlord.
I don't know if I've seen that one.
So, just to give a brief synopsis of the
Mhm.
movie, basically, it's a group of paratroopers dropped before D-Day to blow up a radio station that was going to be crucial. It was actually a radar station, excuse me, that would have been crucial for planes to provide support for the D-Day landings. And basically, they end up going into this small French town and discovering this whole big underground bunker system, and ends up being German super soldier serum zombie type deal going on.
So it turns into a horror movie essentially.
Essentially, yeah,
Yeah.
we kind of the first like 40 minutes of the movie are kind of like a historical World War II movie, and then all hell kind of breaks loose.
Interesting take on D-Day.
Yeah,
I mean, I
for
think it does
sure.
highlight the American. I don't want to say it's propaganda, but just kind of I don't know, maybe the characterization of Nazi
American
experiments.
patriotism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And we do like to look at the Nazi science experiments as trying to create some kind of Superman.
Right, which I'm I mean, I'm sure was not out of the question. I mean, every side wants to create, the perfect soldier.
Right.
The Germans definitely went a little too far when creating some of the stuff they did. The drug combinations.
True. I'd say that most
True.
militaries would be hesitant to cook up some of the cocktails that they had for their personnel.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, maybe not in that time period. I mean, but you look later on, for instance, things like MK Ultra, run by our government.
Right. Which, yeah, I guess not necessarily a military project, but a civilian government project.
Hmm.
All trying to achieve something similar, though.
I would agree.
But kind of I guess to reel it back in, um, a little closer to what we're talking about with U571. I do agree. I think the interactions are accurate, and I think it does depict an American submarine crew fairly well. But even I poked around and looked at kind of how active the American submarine units were in the Atlantic, and there really are not a lot of records of American submarines in the Atlantic doing anything real spectacular at all. Really, I think their glory was kind of in the Pacific, and then I think the British had a fairly good run with their submarines in the Mediterranean during the early war period. And I think
Yeah,
you could have made a movie that would have been just as interesting set over there if you wanted to depict the contributions of the American submarine units during that war.
yeah, I would agree.
And I don't know if y'all have seen it, but there is a very good U-boat movie called Das Boot,
I
which
have.
it is incredibly long, but I think it does give you a more authentic feel for submarines.
It's been a very long time since I've seen the movie,
Mhm.
but from what I remember, it was a pretty long, intense experience.
It is. I think the director's cut is something like 270 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember there being some of that also kind of psychological, stress in there, being in a U-boat, with things like, anti-submarine activities going on above you and sonar at the time, as crude as it was, still being relatively effective, I suppose.
Right. And I will give it to you 571 for that one scene with the depth charging. That was, I think, depicted how terrifying that would be.
Yeah,
Because I
yeah,
mean,
for
it's
sure.
dead silent under the water. And I even looked up, if someone's sonar pinging you, at least at that time period, and even modern day, you can hear it in the submarine.
Mm.
So they would have heard them hunting for them, and then they would have heard the charges coming down.
Which I'm sure just has an absolutely almost, paralyzing effect on a person.
I mean, there's
It
no
definitely
escape
sounds
out
like
of
it
that
would be.
thing. That's all right, Trevor, go ahead.
As I know, it definitely sounds like it would be just horrendous to just be sitting there and hearing the sound of it ping off of you.
Right. And knowing that, if they're hearing you, they know where you are, and they're going to drop an explosive canister down there, and it's going to, if it doesn't outright burst the submarine, it's going to sink you to the bottom, and you're going to be trapped. There's no way out.
Yeah. And not only that, but not making sound yourself, having to
Right.
remain dead silent on board.
Yeah, rig for silent running they can't even really talk that loud, and they depict them whispering back and forth for fear of being detected.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything more in particular we want to cover on that, or moving on?
No, I think it's pretty safe to move on at this point.
I think you did a good job.
Sure. Thank you. All right, Trevor, do you want to run through yours as well?
Yeah. So mine is based on the movie Greyhound, which, although it wasn't a real event, or it was a real event, but it wasn't a real ship that was in the movie. The battle was based around convoys. America would always, before the war started for us, we would send supplies to the Allies through giant convoys, and the British and us after 1941 actually started convoy escorting them. And wolf packs, multiple U-boats would hunt these fleets down to try to sink them because it's very valuable to have supplies in a war.
Yeah.
Definitely, especially from that transatlantic freight was, I know, a lifeline for the Allies during the war.
Yeah,
Oh, for sure. It definitely played a, I would say, a critical role in keeping kind of the British afloat during that early war period.
but it being something, watching the life of how it was on a destroyer and this Arctic environment was not a place I would want to be because you could see the people freezing and you had to stay awake because the submarines chasing your convoy. So no matter what you wanted to do, you'd have to take your shift, but you'd still be up for 14 to 16 hours a day. And it was just a brutal way to live.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I did like. Um, it does. I know there are a few scenes where they specifically point out how multinational the escort and the convoy force is.
Yeah, there were ships from Sweden, America, Canada, Britain. There was
Yeah,
just, you had to have all the protection you could get. Almost as many destroyers as there were convoy ships.
Right.
for sure. And I personally haven't had time to see the movie yet,
Okay.
but definitely from what I've seen through kind of trailers, reviews, and through discussion, I definitely think from the outside, it definitely gives a kind of historically entertaining feel to it. I feel like it's one of those movies where you know it's going to be entertaining, but at the same time, there's going to be some information in there for you.
The things that were happening, like the ships that were sunk, they were sunk in real life.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is actually quite an interesting for them to actually name specific ships that were sunk and reflect that in the movie.
Yeah, I thought it was good.
And I
Actually, the
guess.
HMS Bulldog was in this convoy escort.
Oh, was it?
Yeah,
Interesting. I guess that's kind of a nod to that ship's success as well.
yeah, it went on for quite a long time,
Mhm.
the entire war.
Yeah, I think that also kind of plays into kind of the success that I feel like is kind of ignored a lot, but the success of things like British destroyer captains. These guys were real manly men. I mean, to imagine a destroyer is not a very large ship at all compared to some of these ships. And I mean,
Sure.
take for instance, the sinking of the Bismarck. We had, what was it, the Corsac, I believe, that just straight charged to get within torpedo range of this absolutely massive ship, the Bismarck.
That's like a 2,000-ton destroyer compared to a 50,000-ton battleship.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, even the secondary guns on this battleship would have no problem absolutely tearing it apart.
They were bigger than the Cossacks' guns.
Yeah.
That's just scary.
And even I saw the surface engagements, and I know the movie does a good job of this, depicting that a lot of the submarine action happens at night. And they
Yeah,
can't see. This is before the age of night vision and thermal. And these guys just they couldn't see anything. One of the convoy ships would get attacked, and these destroyer crews just charged the submarine, knowing that they could take a torpedo hit at any time.
yeah, and just ramming it was an actual viable option to take it down.
Right.
And seeing the enemy or the friendly destroyers were actually trying to hit it with machine gun fire and ended up shooting their own ship
Hmm.
and hurting or killing multiple people on board because it's just so dark you can't see what you're shooting at.
Right. And I know the submarines sit a lot lower than the destroyers are,
Yeah,
even when they're popped out on the surface.
yeah, it's not
For sure.
much.
And I did like there was a scene where the guns on the destroyer couldn't depress low enough to actually hit the submarine.
Yeah, and
Really?
then you had to use the AA guns to actually try to hit them.
Yeah.
But even those had a hard time doing it. You had to wait for someone who could shoot it, which is going to end up you could potentially hit an ally.
I mean, yeah. Naval fire, I guess, was not particularly dead on accurate at the time, and hitting something small like a surface submarine would not be an easy task.
Yeah, this little box that's sitting above the water. Just but watching them go through depth charges, so many, because he was panicked
Mhm.
and he didn't want this submarine to get away. He ended up launching almost all of his depth charges in one go. And I don't know if there's an account for this in real life, but I assume people or captains would accidentally go through their supplies a little too fast when trying to hunt a submarine down.
Right. And I feel that I agree. I think that's something that's not depicted as enough, maybe in these types of films, is that these guys had limited resources. He couldn't just infinitely depth charge the ocean around him. He only had so many options to deal with these things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And imagine the pressure, these convoy escort fleets were under. I mean, not only the amount of people's lives that were kind of counting on them to get across the ocean safely, but just also the countries in general with the trade goods and supplies being sent.
Yeah. And these convoy ships were gigantic in comparison. The amount of stuff that
Absolutely.
they were able to carry that you would lose if they were able to sink one.
Mm. I'm sure that type of pressure does something to you as well.
Yeah. You would definitely feel terrible if you let anything happen to them if it's on your watch. All right.
I was going to bring up one
If
more thing on that real
oh,
quick.
go ahead.
I don't know if you poked into it, but there are a few scenes in the movie where I know the captain of the destroyer is able to actually listen in. The U-boats directly call him over the radio to taunt him.
Yeah, I don't believe that was something that you could do because of military encoding.
Yeah, I didn't know if you
But
dug up and looked and see if that was actually something that they did or not.
I looked into it, like looked into it a little bit, but I didn't see anything of it actually happening.
Yeah, I was a little like I guess it added to the pressure of the movie, but I was a little skeptical that a U-boat would do that.
Yeah,
I seriously doubt historically a U-boat captain would
Mhm.
risk the integrity of not only his vessel and his crew, but the wolf pack in general.
Right.
yeah,
And
I
even
mean,
some of the radio calls the guy had during the movie, he was telling him how many submarines were out there, which I
yeah.
feel
He
like
really
for a
not helping
U-boat
yourself
pack,
out.
it's a huge mistake to make.
oh, absolutely. I mean, just, like you said earlier, supplies. These submarines were not massive ships, and to maintain their survivability in essence, they could not be massive, and they had a very limited supply of torpedoes.
Yeah, probably like 12.
And I would imagine knowing how many U-boats are out there is a massive advantage, because then okay, if we see this many torpedoes launched, we have a rough estimation of how much they have left.
Yeah, and he was able to count down. They destroyed each one. He's like, now I know how many there are.
Mm. Just out of curiosity, because I haven't seen the movie, is there
Mhm.
any scenes in the movie where they attempted to shoot a torpedo out of the water?
They actually did not because it was so hard to spot because most of the engagements took place at night.
Gotcha.
Yeah, if I remember right, a lot of the engagements only took place after a convoy ship got hit, and that's the only reason that they knew something was happening.
Yeah, like people would be sleeping and keeping watch, but just all of a sudden a convoy ship would just explode,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you're wide awake and you got guys looking everywhere.
I mean, I imagine it'd be wildly difficult to spot these torpedoes. I mean, they're not big, jet powered things. These are, relatively quiet, I would imagine, propelled devices under the water, therefore dampening the sound even more.
Yeah, I mean you can't have sonar running all the time. They just didn't.
And to that point, was sonar at the time effective enough? I don't know if anybody knows to even detect something as small and quick as a torpedo.
I'm not sure.
I don't know if you could pick up a torpedo, but I know they could pick up the subs if they were within the cone that they were searching.
Yeah,
Right, because I mean, at the time, sonar was a fairly primitive kind of version of what we know as sonar now.
yeah.
I know one big leg up the Allies did have was radar.
Mm.
And I think even, I'm not sure if that movie depicts it. No, I think they do with the radar is when a U-boat would surface, they could start to pick it up.
Yeah, radar guided guns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I know the Allies had a big priority of keeping that information away from the Germans.
American radar was extremely advanced compared to other countries.
Interesting.
All right, so want to move on to the next one?
Sure. Is this for your
All right.
negative example, I'm guessing?
Yes.
Sure.
Inglorious Bastards.
Ah, yes.
So I don't know, Dan, if you want to help bounce, I guess, questions.
Yeah.
That way I could try to give you my answers off of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
You want to
let's
start with just
take
kind of a brief summary on it as well?
Um,
For whoever out there just needs a quick refresher.
yeah. So it's a movie based on what the Nazis were trying to flush out Jews from, well, wherever they occupy. And in Paris, this I think it's Joseph Goebbels is trying to make a movie propaganda film to try to help rise. How would I put this?
patriotism.
Yeah, we really want to bring up the morale for the country.
Yeah.
All right.
And I guess we kind of see them, the American operation, really try to kind of put together this quote unquote elite commando team to kind of go in and, in theory, stop the film from being aired.
Yeah.
And we really see the ante of the movie, I think, upped when they introduced the fact that the German leader, Hitler, at the time, was actually going to be at the premiere of the movie.
Yeah, that would definitely make things very difficult. You know, it would be heavily guarded.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, let's just jump right into it. I mean, let's straight into how do you feel about the kind of the forming of the American team that they kind of sent in?
Um, I'm having a hard time with this one.
Kind of a unconventional set of members to send in, I feel like.
I'll jump in to get you kind of started, Trevor, if you want
Yeah,
on that. If I remember right, I think he partially picks the team because they're all Jewish,
Yes.
which I'm not sure at
Uh
the time if that would have happened.
I, now that you bring it up, yeah, I don't think there would have been that many to be able to find in America at the time.
No, but I think you could have found them. I just don't know if the army would. I don't know if they create a unit solely based on that distinction.
Yeah, I don't
I
feel like you would want
definitely
them.
don't. Yeah, I definitely don't feel like that would be a driving factor for recruiting someone for a specific role.
Yeah, they definitely would have grabbed anyone they could,
I
or
think the
someone who had
more
good training.
qualified person, yeah, definitely takes priority in realism.
And I think especially, I think it's easy for us to look back and, realize the horrors of the Holocaust, but I think at the time, I don't know if that early in the conflict, if Americans would have had a real grasp about the extent of the Holocaust.
Definitely not.
Right. And almost to kind of follow up on that point, as touchy as the subject as the Holocaust is,
Mhm.
I mean, we see, the movie opens with our kind of semi-main German protagonist actually hunting a group of Jewish refugees hiding. And I'm not sure off the top of my head if they gave timestamps for that, but I feel like by the time America would have been sending in commando teams for operations like this, I feel like it was rather late in the war for kind of, hunting parties in essence on the German side in France for that.
Uh, I'm sure the bulk of it would have happened, but I wouldn't imagine that it ever really stopped completely.
Yeah.
But to your point, I think the incident in the beginning happens kind of, I don't know if it timestamps it, but I'm guessing that was probably in the 1941, 42 kind of era.
I believe it was timestamped at 1941.
Okay.
Interesting.
It's been a while since I watched that, but I do remember kind of how the plot moves.
I watched it, but
Yeah.
I'm so blanked on it.
It's kind of there's a lot that goes on in that movie, so I can definitely understand the kind of blanking. I mean, that movie really does. I mean, we kind of follow 3, 4 simultaneous different storylines happening. I
Yeah,
mean, we see, the owner, the young female French owner of the theater, and her kind of whole story and evolution throughout the film, as well as the American team, the German protagonist,
both of them.
both of them. Yeah. Yeah, there is 2 German protagonists in that film, I suppose. Do you remember off the top of your head the name of the sniper that the film was actually based on?
Um,
Mm.
no.
Because it makes me curious if not only if that film was an actual occurrence, but the person it was based off.
I think a lot of the people that it were based off of were actually fake characters,
Got you.
which is
Um,
unfortunate. But
the big ministers were real though. I mean, obviously Goebbels and
no, Hitler
yeah,
for
Goebbels,
sure.
Hitler, and was it Goering? I think was around for part of it. But yeah, I mean, obviously the main German character we follow that's the SS officer. I mean, he's clearly just a caricature of the SS at that point.
Yeah.
All right, just to circle back real quick, Dan, did you have anything to add on the kind of the team composition?
Um, aside from very selectively picking members out because of their religion,
Hmm.
I think we also kind of seen an interesting dynamic in them introducing kind of a German prisoner of war that was imprisoned for crimes against Germany by Germany.
Hmm.
I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic to throw in there, you know, because I think society as a general kind of has this idea of German society at the time being very kind of ideological, fanatical community. And I think throwing that kind of criminal esque anti German character in was maybe not the smartest thing to do, but I can appreciate where they're coming from with it.
I do agree. I guess I will give it a positive mark for introducing a character that's a member of the Wehrmacht that's not just a Nazi,
Yeah.
because that did exist.
Yeah.
And I did just look it up.
Hmm.
Uh, Frederick Zoller was the name of the sniper in that movie that they were making the movie about. Um, is not a real character. The only 2 people in that movie that were historically named would have been Goebbels and Hitler.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that they did make propaganda movies like that.
For
I'm
sure,
sure
absolutely.
maybe, but it
I
definitely
mean,
has
that was
something I know about.
Goebbels.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
his
that was
job.
Goebbels' whole job in Germany.
All right, either of y'all, anything else we want to kind of dive into on this one?
I'm not sure.
Um, I think kind of an interesting thing to bring up is the cooperation we see. I mean, we do have that kind of base America team that's already in German lines, kind of causing terror and doing some kind of bush warfare tactics. But we do see in the movie, I don't know if anyone remembers, the uh, the British actually introduce their own component in for the main operation that the movie is based on, and that was actually a British-led operation, technically in the movie.
Oh, I
Yes,
didn't know that.
I remember Mike Myers' character popping out for
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah, he was the British agent that the British sent in. At the time, it wouldn't have been the SAS. I'm sorry, I'm blanking. It would have been considered
OSS, I think.
OSS. Yeah, yeah, and I think that's kind of interesting thing to note is everyone thinks about that movie and kind of forgets about that character, but technically speaking, the operation we see in that movie uh, to essentially kill the people at the movie and stop it from showing was actually a British operation in the movie that utilized an American team.
Yeah,
And I
so
think it's interesting to show that cooperation.
Yeah, so they co-opted the American commando team that was already established on the ground to help carry
Right.
it out. So I think if I remember right.
Yeah, which I think is kind of an accurate representation too. I mean, I would say it probably wouldn't have been uncommon for you know them to use assets from allied nations that were already on the ground and familiar.
Right, I know the British did a good amount of that, and they would drop in agents in places like, was it in some of the Norwegian, was it Norway or Sweden? Did they drop some commandos in
Um,
to kind of
Norway, they did a
pump up?
lot of
I
yeah,
know Czechoslovakia as well, to pump
Oh yeah.
up some of the local resistance groups.
yeah, I know Norway, the British sent a lot of operatives into Norway. Cuz that was I feel like a kind of underrated. I guess it's kind of a topic for a different time, but
Right.
Norway was quite a strategic zone to control.
Yeah, I mean, for the German Navy, that must have been huge for them to have that.
Yeah, not only the navy but the iron supply as well.
Yeah.
No, I think that pretty much covers everything I would say about the movie, though.
I
Yeah.
would point out, and I don't know, at least from my remembering the film, I think it did further than I think any of the movies we discussed. It does kind of it glorifies the violence a little bit more than the other ones we've seen.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say the violence in that movie is a core focus for the movie.
Mhm. I mean, I mean that's especially with the director at the helm of that one. I know that's kind of his style, but I
Right.
think in a lot of the more historically focused military films, it's when the violence is depicted, it's to show the brutality of the situation. In that movie, it's kind of almost for pure entertainment.
Yeah.
Yeah. In which, to be fair, for those that don't know, Quentin Tarantino was the director of that film,
Yes.
and that's definitely his style. As seen with things like Kill Bill, for instance. Is probably one of his bigger titles.
Right. I mean, not that I didn't enjoy Kill Bill. It was interesting in a movie that tries to. I don't think he was even trying to really be historically accurate, but it's the violence is very in your face.
I would almost place Inglorious Bastards almost in kind of a historical satire genre.
Right.
Because while there is the historical element there, again, the only two real characters in the movie would have been Goebbels and Hitler.
Right. I do think that Tarantino plays on the American theme of I don't know, I'm sure it's not uniquely American, but there's a very much a push towards violence against Nazis is positive.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they're still humans too. And
Um,
not all Nazis were like bad people, you know?
well, the way that he makes the movie, I don't know if you'd see that.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And I guess that's kind of the satire part, is it showing you that, yes, the Germans and the Nazi Party really, in particular, did horrible things to people, but the violence in that, I mean, one of the opening scenes, they beat a guy to death with a baseball bat who
Yeah.
was an unarmed prisoner.
And to be fair, I feel like that also kind of reflects maybe not historically accurate, but the kind of attitude of the American populace at the time. I mean, when I was young, I read a book. I can't for the life of me remember it now, but just talking about that brought it up. Just briefly, it was a book about a young boy in a town on the Eastern Shore, and one of the people that lived in the town was an old German immigrant who was a painter, and we see the town kind of abuse and in some instances beat this old man just for the simple fact that he was born in Germany.
Right. Was there any ties to the Nazi Party for him, or was it just
um no, not in the book. He was in no way a supporter of uh the Nazi party or even Germany in general at the time. He was just somebody that had immigrated there in his early adulthood and was now an old man and was being essentially tormented for his heritage.
right now? I will say that's not something that's uniquely American, and I'm sure in some subsequent episode we'll cover a similar topic that civilization's been doing that for a long time.
Absolutely.
But that's our, I guess, our adaptation of it within our culture.
For sure.
I mean, nowadays, obviously, it's not seen as much, but I'm sure amongst some members of that generation that lived through that time period, it might still be present for them.
Mm, absolutely.
All right. Anyone else want to cover anything for this one?
No.
No, I think we've covered a fair amount. Just taking a quick peek at the clock here, we are kind of rounding about on the 1 hour time mark.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess we can wrap it up then.
Absolutely.
So just to close out, I think this is a good first discussion and kind of covered what's going to be the overarching theme for this series. All right, guys, any last minute closing thoughts?
Well, thanks for stopping by, checking us out. Uh, stay interested, people. Never stop asking questions.
Definitely.
See you next week.
Sounds good. We will end it there.